Welcome to another conversation in practical theology between Saiyyidah Zaidi and Eric Stoddart. Today we are going to be looking at COP26. COP26 is essentially the conference that is taking place in Glasgow looking at environmental issues. And some people have described it as the last opportunity for governments to change their policies or really explore them to have an impact on the environment in terms of the legacy that we leave going forward. Now, the reason we've decided to look at this today is because there are a lot of theological kind of responses and impacts on the environment. And I think it's something that particularly practical theologians should be exploring. And at the same time, there hasn't been, certainly reported in the media, enough of a response to it. Now, Eric, I know you attended a conference at the weekend, didn't you?
That's right. And I think that was a conference organised by my own Centre for the Study of Religion and Politics at the University of St Andrews as essentially a fringe event. But involving scholars from around the world, online, different time zones, giving us perspectives from Brazil as well as from, I think, Chile, from other parts of South America, and as I say, around the world. A lot of those are scholars of religion. They're not necessarily practical theologians. They're from a variety of different faith perspectives as well. So it wasn't in any sense an exclusively Christian event. But I'd like to pick up what you said there about the lack of practical theology voice in the news, because there are lots of practical theologians who are doing work on the environment. But it's an interesting perspective that how does practical theology get itself into the news? How do practical theologians' voices about people's lived experience of the environmental crisis actually get out there? Because there's a lot of talk at the moment in the press about COP26, about the environmental crisis, about the urgency and people's activism and perspectives. And I'm sure many people who are activists will be doing that from their respective faith positions. But we're having a conversation about practical theology, and it intrigues me as to why it might be that practical theologians in that guise aren't perhaps as prominent as we would like them to be. But maybe that's a bit of a red herring. I don't know what you think.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the BIAPT conference a few months ago was exploring environmental issues, and so I think that there is a lot of interest from professional and academic practical theologians. And if we argue that practical theology is about the practice of theology, what it's like in real life, then one could say that anyone with a spiritual practice in line with environmental issues and all of these other things is demonstrating a response. I just think sometimes it's not framed with the practical theology language. So maybe there's something about the languaging that's used around it. But I also think that in some ways, and we're getting to a much bigger issue here, the media doesn't necessarily want to hear from people who are saying, I'm recycling because, or I'm not eating as much meat, etc., because I have a particular religious or spiritual perspective on it.
Yeah, and I think you're right. There's a media interest when there have been groups of pilgrims of all faith perspectives crossing Scotland or coming up from further south in the UK, and that attracts a little bit of media attention because there's, in the very best sense of the word, there's a theatre there. There's a performance, and that is really attractive to the media because it's a human story. It makes what's happening understandable and relatable for people, whereas great long documents are absolutely necessary for international agreements, but they're not what's going to light anybody's enthusiasm necessarily, but seeing people marching, going on pilgrimage around issues of environmental emergency, I think that's a way that the media rightly is attracted to present that. But does it really matter if practical theologians are known to be involved as practical theologians? Maybe that's just something that from within the guild we would like to be more prominent. But is that what really matters? Does it really matter if someone's identified publicly as a practical theologian? I'm not so sure.
Gosh, that's such a big existential question, and I think, you know, we were speaking earlier about how I'm coming up to the kind of final stages of my thesis, and the question in there that I'm partly looking to address is, am I a practical theologian? And in some ways, the labeling of it, in my opinion, is irrelevant. It's the practices that I'm doing. What are the things? How do I show up? How am I responding? If I was to call myself a practical theologian, does that impact on the amount of meat that I eat and whether I recycle or not? Not particularly. But in some ways, thinking about, you know, am I doing it as an act of worship? That makes me, in some ways, it makes me quake, because all of a sudden you're thinking, gosh, these day-to-day mundane things we're doing actually being observed by God, and that reminder itself is quite scary.
Yeah, and over the years we've done these conversations, we've often sort of touched on the idea that maybe practical theology is as much a way of life or a way of being as it is an intellectual pursuit. And there is something about wanting that intellectual pursuit to be recognized and the contribution of that to be recognized. But maybe that's part of the red herring, that practical theology is fundamentally a way of being. It's a way of seeing the world through our respective theological and faith tradition lenses, but it's a disposition to be in the world. Now, yeah, I would never want to take away from the academic dimensions of practical theology, but as a way of being. And when I see the news of the pilgrims walking across Scotland, I think there is, whether people are recognizing themselves and would be at all interested in being defined as practical theologians, is neither here nor there. But that's, to me, an expression of faith in practice. But it's not only done through writing. It's not only done through conversation. It's done through actually walking on the earth. And that I really admire. I've not been on those sorts of pilgrimage. I took part in an online conference. That was my contribution to it. But I really admire those folks who have put one foot in front of the other, and they've tramped through what was pretty miserable Scottish weather. I've gone walking in Scotland before, and it can be really horrible. It's fantastically beautiful, but those pilgrims were not driving or being driven from one venue to the other. They were doing this, and in the old-fashioned way of putting one foot in front of the other, with waterproofs, hopefully that were waterproof, but from my own experience, that isn't always the case. And if you turn up in Glasgow as a soggy pilgrim, there's a spiritual issue there and a spiritual development, but there's a witness element, and there's an intellectual element, there's an embodied element. And whether or not practical theology badges get stuffed on you at Glasgow is just neither here nor there. But to me, it has resonances with the concerns we have as practical theologians: embodiment, lived experience, the practice of faith. And I don't want to co-opt people as practical theologians, but I want to honor what they're doing and saying it looks a lot like practical theology.
Mm. And it's fascinating, because I agree with you. And when I was watching the news and seeing the walks, I think some people have walked from London to Glasgow. And I have to say, for a second, I just thought, gosh, can't I just abandon everything and join them? Because it just sounds like such a spiritual journey to go on. But at the same time, it's such a challenge to do something like that. So for me, the people that have gone on these pilgrimages and have walked are incredibly honourable people in doing something, I think, on behalf of all of us, because they're highlighting issues in a way that some of the politicians who are, I mean, gosh, even they're still flying from London to Glasgow, you know, whereas one could get the train, and trains are so much more environmentally friendly. I mean, I as a side note, if the Queen can get a train, then why can't some of our leaders, you know? And one thinks that the idea of walking and that journey brings with it not just the act of going from A to B physically, but as you described, just all of the other learning and growth and development that comes with it. And I really like the way that you've kind of said, well, essentially what I heard was, do we really need that label? You know, and I think if you're doing the work of a practical theologian and you're not called that, or you don't want to be, does it really matter? And kind of like taking that to a meta level. In many ways, I think people leave faiths because there's an expectation that one should conform to certain rituals and have certain practices and things, and they don't want to do those things anymore, and so they then feel alienated, and as that kind of keeps going and trickling down in them intellectually and spiritually, they end up walking away from faith. And that then brings me to a kind of question of how do we make sure that people stay within faiths, but also are able to practice in the way that they wish to? Because I think that is a key issue that isn't really explored enough.
I would probably frame it slightly differently in the danger of practical theology and the danger of thinking critically about faith and the practice of faith and the way in which faith is lived experience. And when someone is asking those critical questions, that's a dangerous position to be in, because for some people that leads them deeper into their faith tradition. For others, it leads them further to the edges of the faith tradition. And I'm not sure why some people go in one direction and others go in another. But that critical thinking about what are we doing? Why do we have to do it this way? Why do we have to be in our faith traditions expressing it in this particular manner and not in that particular way? That's asking dangerous questions. As much as those can be questions that deepen our understanding of faith, they can sometimes problematize faith. And that can be either paralysis, or it can lead to greater questions and deeper engagement, or it can sort of spin off into the margins. It's dangerous.
Yeah, it's interesting because from what I understand about Islam, one of the things that we're supposed to do is question rituals. So, for example, I pray 5 times a day. Do I know why I'm doing it, or am I doing it just because my parents did it and other people are doing it? And so there's a lot of instruction that's given in terms of the knowledge that an individual and the knowledge that the community has, and the separation between that is called fard ain and fard kifaya. And so, for example, if someone dies, the funeral rituals, someone within the community has to know how to bury a person. I don't necessarily need to know that. I need to know what's important for me. So, for example, the prayers, ablution, anything else that is to do with what it is to be a Muslim woman in this world at the moment. So that when I meet God and God kind of says, well, why did you do that way? Then there's some form of an explanation rather than, oh, just because, I don't know, John down the street did it. And I'm going to link this to environmental issues in a minute, because I think the thing is that having that information and understanding why you do things gives, certainly for me, it's given me the ability to know what is right and what is wrong. And I know there's a whole other conversation that we can have just about those few words, but it then helps me to have boundaries, because sometimes the rituals and what have become societal norms of practicing religion aren't necessarily the essence of what that faith is. And I suppose in linking all of this back to COP26 and the environment, for me, there's a real sense that people don't know why they recycle. We're all told it's a good thing to do. Why should we make sure that we turn our lights off? Why should we care about these things? But because we don't really understand the impact that it has, other than recycling becomes a burden for some, we don't do it and we don't pay as much attention. And so the rules need to be given to us. And then when we see contradictions in our leaders saying, oh, well, you must do this, but I'm going to do something else, then the whole thing just blows open.
Yeah, and why we do something, I think, is so multifaceted, because we'll do something because we get even the vaguest sense that this is an emergency. And so I'm not a scientist, so I don't understand the technicalities of the emergency, but I get the fact that this is an emergency. And that, to me, has come through brilliant documentaries. And, just to pick out David Attenborough as one supreme example of that. And those nature documentaries that have looked at the effects of what humans are doing and showing us the details of that, not in a high scientific way, but in a visual way, in an intelligent and understandable way. It's been those visuals that makes, for me, the big difference, because as I say, I'm not a scientist. And so there's one level of being motivated to do something there, because you sense there's a crisis and you want to do something. And maybe that's the thing, that lots of people doing little things is one element of this. There needs to be the major international agreements, but those of themselves, as vastly significant as they are not really going to be the only way forward for this. Lots of us can do lots of little things. It's the business model of major companies that, I'm not going to give them any advertising, but we know they distribute things to our houses. Their business model is based on not necessarily selling lots of a few things, but very few of lots of things. And that's a big difference. And that's how these sorts of companies have made their money. Lots of small things being bought by lots of people. And I think there's a parallel there for how certainly I would want to approach the environmental issues, that there are lots of things, little things that lots of us can do. There's still a place for some big things to be done, absolutely. But what we do does matter. And that's an issue of faith as well. And I appreciate the folks will be motivated from non-faith positions to engage in ecological concern. But for those of us that have a faith perspective, there's something about what we do individually mattering. And that's reassuring that in the Bible there are parables about scattering seed, and you don't know in the parable where the seed's going to fall. Some of it's going to fall on good ground, some of it's going to fall on stony ground, some of it's going to fall on ground and the thorns come up and smother it. And there are various meanings in those parables, but there's something there about seeds being cast, and you don't know what's going to happen, but you got to sow a lot of seeds.
Mm. Mm. And is it, you're sharing that parable is kind of leading me to the kind of hadith that we have in Islam, which says that if you have a seed in your hand and the end of time is here, still plant it, with the idea being that a small action, and hope associated with it can change things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really like the way that you're saying that we all individually have some sense of responsibility, and the actions that we take, regardless of faith perspective or not, have an impact. And that kind of makes me think that what I'm asking for is the impossible, but wouldn't it have been really nice to have had a parallel conference to COP26, which is the committee of the parties, and all of the kind of, the great people that lead the countries coming together? Wouldn't it have been wonderful to have a formal parallel conference with papers from real people and academics sharing their own lived experience and bringing in ideas for what can be done? Because I don't need to be told by a car manufacturer, buy my car because it's going to help. Really what I need to know is how is someone on the ground doing it?
I'm not so sure a conference, because if you want to extend the metaphor, there's a conference happening all around about us all the time. I think of, I'm very privileged where I live in Edinburgh. I'm not far from woodland. And some of that is naturally regenerating woodland. Some of it is woodland that was laid out relatively recently. Other parts of it look like they were woodland that was set out, a couple of hundred years ago. So it's a great mixture. But as I'm walking around that woodland and I see things that there's an avenue called the Avenue of Yew Trees. And it was set out there, I think, in the early 19th century, so that a particularly wealthy lady could go from her house and go for a walk down a beautiful path up to an old ruined castle. And the benefits that those of us have now, years and years later, that to me is a sort of thing like a conference that's out there in the open air, because those are the contributions of people from 150, 200 years ago, planting things. And those have partly regenerated naturally, partly it's been managed. But all around about us, if I can open my eyes, I can see those equivalent of conference papers as people have acted in the past. And, in parts of Scotland, we have beautiful land that has been set up and managed over hundreds of years, and we have properties that have been maintained over hundreds of years. And there is the message of people before us. They've looked not just at the present, but they've looked at the future and said, we're going to do something for our great-grandchildren in the way that we set out these grounds, or the way that we preserve. Now, okay, there's lots of downsides to that as well, but let's just focus on the positive side of it. There are those sorts of markers that people have put down, their lived experience. I can see that now, hundreds of years later. And to me, that speaks volumes of, okay, what am I going to leave behind me? Maybe I can plant trees, maybe do something else. But it's recognizing that I'm just a point on this long trajectory of humans who have done good for the environment as well as bad. And it's a sort of conference that's round about me.
Yeah, I really like that. And I never thought about it like this, but when you're explaining it like that, it is really, really appealing. And there's something kind of quite informal about that. which is wonderful and accessible to everybody. I suppose the challenge that I have is that these things are not shared within the media. And so that then means that small things are happening locally, which are really, really powerful. And you share a very evocative story of the street of yew trees, which just sounds absolutely wonderful. But maybe what I'm trying to say is that because social media and media is so dominant now in terms of how we think, that some of this messaging about the small things that we do and the impact that we have is being lost, because all we're doing is hearing about leaders who in many respects are have a huge ambition but are getting it wrong.
Yes, social media, I don't want to come down unilaterally negatively on social media, because a lot of the activism has been facilitated and made, and people have been enthused and they've got involved in environmental activism through social media. But I think part of our urgent task is to sift through social media. Maybe it's back to that parable again about the seeds being thrown out, that social media are maybe another version of those seeds that are thrown out. Some bits of social media will grow and be worthwhile. Others will get crowded out by the thorns, and they could have been worthwhile, and other bits just fall on stony ground. So the metaphor is beginning to collapse already as I share it, but I think there's trying to work our way through the social media, whether it's about environmentalism or anything else. That's a major task, because we're bombarded with entertainment. Some of the entertainment is actually educational. That's what the BBC was set up to do, to educate and inform and entertain. And you can mix those two, but the critical skills that we need to work out what's being presented to us that we would want to take on board and that would be really useful for environmental or other types of activism, and what simply needs to be dropped aside. Those are critical thinking tasks that take an awful lot of effort, because it's easier just to consume it and let it wash over you.
And one of the biggest challenges that I think that we have in the world today is that people are not taught how to think critically. So if I look back at my own education, I never really understood, how do you approach something with that kind of critical lens. So when we did history GCSE, I had a really interesting teacher who essentially said, I'm going to teach you the textbook, but I'm also going to give you a different perspective. And not perhaps kind of being aware of it, maybe, I mean, he just finished his teacher training, so maybe being young and naive and thinking that he was allowed to do that. And he taught us incredibly in terms of providing us with that alternative perspective. So I feel very blessed. But other than that, every time I've been learning, even at master's level, and I think that's the big challenge for me. Essentially, it's kind of like, here's the information and here's how we want you to regurgitate it, which is quite challenging. But I think if there's modules or the ability to learn how to do that critical thinking, then not only do we look at things academically slightly differently, I think our whole lived experience is very different, because then I read the newspapers and I look at the news and documentaries, and I've kind of got that lens of thinking, is this really the truth?
See, I think as human beings, we're a lot more naturally critical thinkers than we give ourselves credit for. I'm immediately going back to the playground in primary school, and that experience where there's two football teams being picked, and there's two of the captains, one of each team, and all of us primary kids are there, and we're getting picked for whichever team. That's critical thinking. The impromptu team captain is engaging in critical thinking about, why do I want to pick that person over that person?
Mm.
When we're choosing our friends, we're engaging in critical thinking. When we're going out shopping, we're engaging in critical thinking. Now, to some extent, we'll do it to a greater or lesser degree, and we'll be more or less conscious of it. But we're taking information, we're evaluating it, we're asking ourselves, who told me that about those people? Has that put me off being their friend or not? Who's told me that about this community that I'm living in? And so we're actually doing a bit of almost discourse analysis. We're trying to think, why are we being told this? Who's telling us? What's to the advantage of the person that's telling us? And when I used to take public transport before COVID, I would sometimes have the joy of sitting on the bus back from Waverley Station in Edinburgh back to my house, and the conversations I could listen in of people complaining about their friends or their neighbours and who did who, what to who, and everything. That is critical thinking because they're evaluating it. Now, I know it's not what as academics we would bless with our great understanding of what critical thinking is, but that's not the point. The point is that people are naturally able to do critical thinking. Are we encouraging people to develop those skills? I'm not sure that as practical theologians we're necessarily tapping into that.
Mm. I never thought about it like that, but I really like the way that you've explained it, because it's giving me a little bit of peace, because at least I'm thinking some of what my kids are doing at school is giving them that critical thinking ability, which was a real challenge for me, because like I would say, like many of us today, what do? You just scroll through your phone and just take things as they're presented to you, and perhaps we've lost the time for questioning that we once might have had. But the way that you've explained that is a different perspective that I never thought about, and kind of trying to bring this particular discussion to a close. Maybe what we do is we observe ourselves in the information that we're receiving about climate change and the challenges that are presented in front of us, and start to think, well, is this really the truth? How can we do something or take some action that is going to kind of give us the result that we're looking for? And kind of, again, those small actions that you described earlier, what are the small things that we can do through the lens of doing theology rather than kind of intellectualizing about it to make that difference?
And we might not know the difference in our lifetime.
Mm.
And that to me is one of the critical things. It's probably a feature of getting older, but there are decisions that we make, there are things that we can do that we're not going to see whether that seed is one of those seeds that bears fruit, or if it gets choked by thorns, or it just lands on the ground. We're not going to live long enough to see some of the consequences of our actions. But that doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be a really positive, humbling thing that says, I'm going to do this like those who planted that avenue of yew trees. I'm enjoying it 150 years later. They weren't thinking that, people like me would have been allowed to wander, the riffraff would have been allowed to wander around those grounds. Those were private grounds reserved for the aristocracy. But now the riffraff like me can enjoy it. And they would never have envisaged that. And that's maybe my point, that when we do little things, we've no guarantee that we're going to see the benefit of that. But that's our investment in the future of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also the investment in kind of in many ways in doing something for the sake of God, and hoping that God will put some blessing in it and enable it to be, certainly from the language that I would use, to be in my book of good deeds and also benefit people in the future, and then thinking about future impact means that we view these little things with a very, very different lens.
So maybe practical theology is about lots of little things.
I think that's a perfect way for us to close today's conversation. There's so many more things that we could discuss in terms of the environment and climate change and things, but the reminder that you've given us about, small little things that we can do is very, very powerful. Thank you, Eric. This has been absolutely brilliant. To people who are listening in, please do make sure that you subscribe, like, and comment as well if there is somewhere for you to comment on the page. And we look forward to seeing you in another conversation in practical theology.